World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM, with a special election edition of our World Affairs Roundup. As Senators Obama and McCain near the finish line in their long race to the White House, we're taking a last-minute look on their positions on key foreign policy issues that captured headlines throughout the campaign. We'll also gaze over the horizon to identify less covered issues likely to demand a new administration's attention. For this glimpse into the global dimensions of the coming McCain or Obama presidency, we're joined by our regular panel of prescient policy prognosticators. John Katzka, a retired Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamiliton, political scientist and coordinator of the International Studies program at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Director of Program for Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome everyone.
Thank you.
Well, John, perhaps we could start with you before we start talking about what either an Obama or McCain presidency might look like with regard to foreign policy. If you could give us some sense of that transition and what kind of hangover there might be from the previous administration, regardless of who wins.
Well, you know, you think in a few days we're going to elect a new president. And in January, we'll go out, he'll be sworn in. And then you think that's it, and now everything starts going forward. Well, it takes a significant amount of time after the president is elected. First, there are the transition teams that go in to every department and agency in Washington, and they put together briefing books. And then there is the debate over who is going to get what job in the new administration. And then there's this vetting process, which has become increasingly more ruthless and takes longer and longer before anyone's name actually gets to the Senate before they can actually go to work. What happens in the meantime is that both in Washington and in the field, in the embassies around the world, things go on with the playbook of the previous administration. Unless something dramatic comes up that changes, that requires the president to come up with a new look on a particular issue, that old playbook still is in use.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about that playbook. You know, much has been written and said about the Bush doctrine. What we are trying to get to today, if we could, I think, is what an Obama doctrine or a McCain doctrine might look like. So, Ann, and you're watching the campaign, do you have any sense of sort of the broadest brush treatment of what kinds of issues might be different under either campaign, or I'm sorry, either administration?
Well, I'll start with Obama because he's the change candidate. And just to add to what John has been saying about the transition period, the candidates have each articulated in various fora their ideas about what will, form the major principles behind their foreign policy, as well as some very concrete ideas about changes they'd like to see, new ideas and the like. But while the president has a lot of power in foreign policy, there are also a lot of other players that will constrain the president's hand. And we also don't necessarily have a clear sense. I think we have a clearer sense of what their ideal doctrine would be from earlier stages of the campaign when they were able to articulate, say, in their foreign affairs articles, what their vision was before they got in the debates and tied up in nuances of language as much. I think that Obama articulated early on a policy whereby he said the security of each and every American depends on the security of each and every other person in the world. And so he has a sense that we're all the common humanity idea in his foreign policy. And so he emphasizes the importance of issues that can't be dealt with on a bilateral basis, or even in the existing multilateral institutions, such as global warming, the war on terror, nuclear proliferation, and he has the idea of setting up some new institutions, working with some of the old ones, but really seeing the world through different eyes, not as great power politics, not as bilateral, multilateral relations, but more in the sense of common security.
So,
and I think that would be the watchword for him, common security.
and how would you contrast Senator McCain's doctrine, if you will, Robert?
Well, a lot more of a traditional foreign policy. In some ways, it's like he's a figure from the Second World War rather than the Vietnam War. You tend to sometimes forget that he fought in the Vietnam War. Much more of a focus on military power and force and bold, strong leadership. Much less of an emphasis on, say, interdependence or other definitions of security. The interdependence focus of Obama may, in fact, over time have gotten something from the environmental movement. It's almost an ecological view, and therefore there's a lot of power that can be developed, according to Obama's view, by foreign aid, by diplomacy and sort of soft power, so to speak, and he talks about Afghanistan in terms of dealing with poverty and dealing with underlying economic and cultural situation and the security situation there, not just about force. Much more of an emphasis on force in McCain, which is closer to the Bush doctrine, though there are clearly important distinctions. And I don't think we should assume a couple days before the election that it will be President Obama. If we were having this taping 60 years ago, we'd be talking about President Dewey and not President Truman, and John might be warning us that we're about to lose China, and so, which of course happened soon after. So you never know in a presidential election.
Well, John, I'm wondering if...
Is he suggesting I'm that old?
Obama has a different sense, certainly, of the appropriateness of the use of military power, but he's not an unabashed pacifist. Now, how would you contrast the two campaigns' use of military force and where interventions are appropriate?
Let me come back to what both of them were talking about, because I think it sets up the dilemma that we have in the post-Cold War period. We've been moving from the industrial into the information age, as well as moving past the Cold War. And so we haven't got a construct yet in place that provides that wonderful strategic view that you were just talking about. In fact, some people say we shouldn't try to get it right now because the range of issues that we have to contend with are important in themselves, and we need to keep a flexibility and an open mind regarding them. John McCain is more comfortable, in terms of your question, in dealing with military power than would be Senator Obama. But on the other side, he also is a strong proponent of soft power and public diplomacy. I mean, I've seen him in the field, and he is very good, and he's nuanced in terms of his understanding of these things. I think he has a tendency, in terms of his public statements, to come out more forcefully than Senator Obama does.
I think that when we're talking about soft power, because it is so subjective in its own way, right away a President Obama would have an advantage over a President McCain, in the sense that just because of their age difference, and because of the fact that Obama has had a very different background, he would already come in with, people are saying just by electing him, the view of the United States would change. So that although the foreign policy might not change, a great deal of the hostility about what the United States has stood for could change overnight. Joseph Nye has written that he imagines that Osama bin Laden is having great headaches about the fact that we might elect an African-American president whose father was born in Kenya and who grew up in Indonesia, because it's just it's such a different kind of enemy for Osama bin Laden to deal with. So on that, it will be, although I certainly do see that McCain has a lot of experience and understands the importance of soft power, it'll be harder for him to push the whole soft power idea, I think.
Well, one of the centerpieces of the Bush doctrine was the idea of actively promoting democracy. How do you see the candidates coming down on that issue, Robert?
Well, I think Ann's right. There's this reservoir of goodwill in Europe, Africa, Latin America, especially towards Obama, which will give him a certain honeymoon. It might be short, but at the beginning.
Does that mean we're going to build democracy in Europe?
Well, Hopefully it's already there in Western Europe, but we can have a debate about that. President Ford famously had a debate about that at Eastern Europe. But the interesting thing is that Obama is talking a lot more about how you build up democracy through economic aid, through aiding various NGOs that would build up civic democracy, how you should intervene more forcefully with fragile young democracies. So much more discussion of that. I think McCain is more in the making the world safe for democracy frame, at least in terms of his public statements. John's right, his diplomacy might be more nuanced, but certainly in terms of the way he presents it, which is important, it sounds more that way. There are also huge differences here in regard to relation to build it to defense spending, quite frankly, because McCain is proposing we increase the percentage of GNP that goes to the military. Obama is suggesting that we don't need giant nuclear arsenals at hair triggers aimed at each other in Cold War style 20 years after the Cold War has ended between Russia and the United States, and is proposing we actually negotiate taking those off of the hair trigger and not building any more nuclear weapons, which is a very important distinction. I heard a right-wing talk show here in Milwaukee attacking Obama for making us unsafe by doing that. So it's at least part of the campaign as focused on the base, but I think that's an important distinction too.
Rather than focusing on democracy promotion, I think it's fair to say both of them are interventionists in the spirit of the Clinton administration and Herbert Walker Bush before that. This is one of the obvious things about the one aspect of the change in the post-Cold War period. We're more willing to get involved. Now the question is going to be where and under what circumstances, and that's where the debate came up over Iraq. I have a harder time on this nuclear debate because I just listened to Gates, the Secretary of Defense, calling into question the nuclear machinery we have today and whether or not it's reliable and sustainable. And so I'm not assigning to anyone any particular wisdom in this regard.
I think that Obama has actually come out and said that he would support going down to zero, and a number of others have come out with that proposal as a very bold leadership step that the United States could take. I think that for the whole democracy issue, you hear continually in a number of fora Obama going back to Roosevelt and talking about needing freedom from want and freedom from fear as being much more important than the basic tenets of democracy as we usually see them. You know, we're not going to be able to, people don't care about being able to vote if they're hungry or they're being attacked in their homes. So there's this real sort of basic level of individual security, human security that precedes democracy, and I don't think that McCain is all that different in his outlook, because both of them see the foreign aid directed at these issues of freedom from want and freedom from fear as a key way of fighting the war on terror. So I think that to a certain extent they come together on that. I think they articulate it very differently, though.
But the one point, it's
Less than a minute.
It's in the background of everything we've been talking about, and where are the resources to do any of these things? And with the cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and the current escalating cost of the financial markets meltdown, the next president is not going to have a lot of flexibility in terms of taking on new adventures or new initiatives.
Well, we're going to talk about some of the economic aspects of coming foreign policy when we come back. First, we'll take a break on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about a possible Obama or McCain presidency with regard to foreign policy with John Katzka and Hamiliton and Robert Kraig. Well, let's turn for a moment to trade, if we could. Robert, what usually is the difference between the two candidates on trade policy?
Well, they're both pro-free trade candidates. Let's face it. There isn't someone who's against the globalization move that we've made over the last couple decades. I would see Obama as closer to the Clinton view that you need environmental standards and you need labor standards. He's evolved to that, and then he thinks it needs to be in treaties, opposed certain treaties that do not have those standards, so it's not just side agreements as Clinton proposed. McCain is more unabashedly for every free trade agreement that's come before him, and isn't focused as much on trying to create quote unquote fair trade. He sees fair trade as protectionism. So really, they're both on the globalization and open trade side, but Obama wants to impose more conditions and deal with some of the issues around outsourcing. But quite frankly, both of them see a lot of that still in terms of economic transition here in this country, job retraining, et cetera. But I think Obama's more for trying to create a fairer playing field, but quite frankly, the details of what that would mean have not been specified. So they're probably closer together on this than some of the other issues we've talked about.
I mean, you look at this from the point of view of their client base. Labor is in Obama's camp, and therefore the labor issue becomes increasingly very important, as well as the environmental community is more large. Well, actually, that's a mixed bag, isn't it? Because there's a lot of people who support McCain as well from the environmental movement. But I see that as more a reflection of their basis than it is of any particular orientation.
Well, what about linking sort of national security and trade issues? I think both campaigns have had something to say about that.
Well, certainly we've got the whole energy issue, which ties it all together, and both of them have had to articulate, pretty strong positions. Both of them are much, they're both environmentalists in the sense that they both, with the exception of Palin, they both recognize the effects of climate change and see this as an issue that should be dealt with, primarily through economic means. Obama is more in that area, focusing more on alternative energies than McCain is. But both of them, see this as a major issue that where the primary focus has to be not only on developing alternative energies, but achieving energy independence for the United States. The devil there is in the details too, and in the politics, I think.
Well, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but there would be a definite change in the perception based on who wins this election internationally. John, I'll let you lead it off. And what do you think the image of the new administration will be based on which candidate wins?
Well, clearly the bellwether for many Americans is how does Europe feel about us? And there's no question that an Obama victory would be seen as a positive step. But Europe has been evolving away from us for some time now. They have come up with a different set of rules and different way of thinking. And so, for example, if as we have been trying to get the Europeans to put more troops into Afghanistan, and Obama has said he wants to elevate that issue and go after it as well. It'll be interesting to see how the Europeans react to a Obama presidency in terms of whether or not they'll supply those troops, just because he is a different spokesman on this particular issue.
Robert?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'd said before, there's could be this reservoir of goodwill towards Obama if he wins, just because that Bush has been probably the most unpopular American president ever on the world scene. I don't think that's hyperbole, unfortunately. And so he's more of a sharp break, and it probably is unfair to McCain that he's seen as more of a continuation of Bush, even though he's had quite a distinct career in terms of foreign affairs.
It's the political line.
Yeah, but no, I think he's probably been unfairly associated. I don't know that he would have, if he won the presidency in 2000, they would have conducted nearly the same foreign policy that Bush has conducted. So Obama has that advantage. The other thing is tone. John pointed out that they both are interested in diplomacy. Obama's tone is very collaborative, and that's going to help. I mean, taking a kind of force stand, and we will force Europe to go along and fund the war in Afghanistan and NATO. That has repercussions in terms of what kind of goodwill and collaborativeness you can actually develop. So you're right. There are these John. There are these distinctions now. Maybe more divide between Europe and the United States, certainly than there was during the Cold War. But there's more of a chance to bridge that gap because Obama is committed rhetorically to a tone and a style of collaborativeness. Sure.
Well, and over the environmental issues, I think we're also going to have the president may say we want to move in with the Europeans and come to a common understanding, but what he is going to be able to put forward as policy is not going to necessarily be that collaboration. So there are going to be differences between us, and whether or not having a nice tone and a good public image is going to be able to bridge our foreign policy interest into the future is going to be a question.
I think that one of the other major issues that we've raised it, but I think it's important to stress again, is the generational difference. And that President Bush talked a lot about the personal relationships he had built with particular leaders and the importance that those had for his foreign policy. And I know that that's just one small aspect of our foreign policy, but I think that the generational difference is big here. I don't know how it's going to translate into, for example, whether or not the Europeans will be willing to send troops. But to the extent that personal relationships play into the development of foreign policy and goodwill towards the United States, there is a huge generational difference. And when you watch Obama and McCain on the stage, one person sends you back and the other person sends you forward. I mean, just in the way they appear, talk.
I guess it depends upon who you are.
Well, Senator Obama's running mate, Joe Biden, sort of famously suggested that very early on, the young president, if it is President Obama, will likely be tested by some adversary. So I'd like to talk a little bit for a while about what you see as potential nature of that test that perhaps hasn't been particularly well covered or hasn't been a talking point in the campaign. I'll throw it open to anyone. And what's something that's likely to have to be dealt with sooner rather than later that's not necessarily on the front burner right now?
Well, let me come at it from something that Ann said earlier about this new internationalism, globalism. And if you look at the current financial market crises, and yes, there was lots of consultations, but every country in the world made their own decisions in terms of how they were going to do that. So that while we are moving forward and coming up with global concepts and global definitions, we are still working out of the model of the nation state. Mm-hmm. And so this is a frustration, and one of the ones who is most challenging these definitions is Russia right now. Russia with $500 billion in reserves and a bruised ego from the way in which especially we treated them since the collapse of the Soviet Union, is looking for adventures and is finding them, and how we react to that is going to be one of the early tests of the new administration.
Well, John stole mine, but I'll put it, let me frame it a different way. It's about NATO and what NATO is going to be. NATO is there's no longer a Cold War. There's a lot of expectations that NATO can do things in Afghanistan and Pakistan, for example, which is the real forefront of the world war on, quote-unquote, war on terror. But there's a lot of disagreements on what it should do, and even each NATO country uses its troops differently in Afghanistan. And so it seems like McCain's approach, at least rhetorically, is we will get NATO to go along. And Obama's is much more, we will figure out how we're going to come together as NATO and how we're going to reinvent the alliance. And that gets down to whether or not NATO should encircle Russia and whether that's the best approach. Quite frankly, Obama's proposing we negotiate a new nuclear situation with Russia where we go off the hair trigger, we stop building new nuclear weapons, and we don't confront them with NATO. And so that's a very different vision, certainly in terms of the vision being presented, than McCain has presented so far.
This has come up in the campaign, but it's the whole issue of humanitarian intervention. It's come up in an abstract way, but not in a specific way. And I think that there's so many places where we say we need to do something, and we need to redefine the circumstances under which humanitarian intervention is acceptable, and it needs to be done multilaterally, I think. The situation in the Congo right now is just horrific, and then Darfur. And while these issues have come up during the campaign, they haven't really been addressed. They can't really be addressed in the campaign. But if Obama is elected president and wants to really shape a new kind of foreign policy, he's going to have to deal with the whole issue of the actual circumstances of humanitarian intervention.
Well, we've got just about a minute left, and I'll throw this open to the panel again. At this juncture, is it really possible to articulate an Obama doctrine or a McCain doctrine, or is the reality of governing so different than the reality of campaigning that everything is sort of back on the table once November 5th arrives?
I think the only thing that produced the Bush doctrine was 9/11. That was the driving force to move that forward and to come up with some way in which to define who we were internationally. Right now, I would agree with what your question, that it is not possible to come up with a doctrine.
I mean, I'd say that there are differences, but that if you're doing a shorthand, that Obama's is much closer to Clinton's, and that McCain's although having serious distinctions, is closer to Bush's approach post 9/11, not Bush when he came to office.
I would say, in shorthand, great power politics versus common security doctrine.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. To our audience, get out there and vote. We'll see you at the polls and see you next time on International Focus.